Now, once the economic powerhouse of West Africa until the 1970s, and also the largest exporter of cocoa in the world, Ivory Coast unfortunately descended into civil war in the early 2000s. Peace returned in 2007 through some sort of a power-sharing agreement. But can a once prosperous African country come back from the brink and make meaningful progress, especially as West Africa embraces global trade? We're now joined by Dr. David Zoumenou, a senior researcher at the Africa Institute, or at the Institute for Security Studies, a researcher on Africa. I'm a bit dyslexic this morning. Thank you very much for coming through. Tell us what are the chances of success. The Ivory Coast is due to hold elections on the 29th of November. These have been postponed so many times, we're not even sure if they'll take place. But do you think now they've finally committed to concluding the peace process and getting the democratic process underway?
Yeah, there seems to be a kind of commitment and hope placing this electoral process to take place in November this year. And this is supported by the registration process that has just been completed that recorded 6.4 million Ivorians were eligible to cast their votes. But also looking at the development in the northern part of the country where you see, at least on the surface, the redeployment of the administration and the commitment of the First Novel to abide by the principle of a Ouagadougou peace agreement signed in November last year.
All right, now assuming that all things are equal and that these elections do take place in November, will they usher in a new economic era for the Ivory Coast?
It will depend on a number of factors. One is you have to accept first the result of those elections, because if those elections are contested or they are fraudulent or give rise to violence, certainly the hopes will be dashed off. But if the results are accepted and the legitimacy of a leader recognized by everyone, the prospect for Ivory Coast to recover economically are very high, because if you look at it compared to other countries in West Africa that went through war, there have not been massive destructions in the country. So the reconstruction process will not be that difficult. Obviously, some economic structures or financial structures need to be cleaned up. The transparency need to be, and certain governance architecture need to be put in place. And this is going to be the key challenge for the government. But also importantly, a very key element that government would need to pay attention to it, the land issue and the agricultural sector that is now collapsing thanks to corruption and mismanagement.
Let's talk about the agricultural sector first. Ivory Coast is known to be the world's largest exporter of coffee, of cocoa, as well as coffee. About 40% of global supply of cocoa comes from the Ivory Coast alone. Now, two factors, unfortunately, are at play. Soft commodity prices are depressed at the moment, so that counts against the Ivory Coast. But the country being in the state of instability also means that cocoa production has been affected. What's being done to revive the sector?
I think the key element, and you rightly pointed out, the government has just put in place a cocoa and coffee marketing board that need a revival, and that need to also review the whole sector and find out things that are not working, because it's partly due to the war that Laurent Gbagbo used to explain the deteriorating importance of that sector. But also another element is the political factor, because once you restore the political leadership, you are able to control how the activities in that sector actually work. And the authority principle that creates friction between various farmers and producers, and also the manipulation of that aspect of the question to buy off a key political actors or political opponents, in my view, will remain a serious impediment to the revival of that. But I think that where lies the economic recovery of Ivory Coast, because if the country slides and fell from top producing of cocoa and coffee, it will be very difficult for it to sustain its economic growth.
Simon, even if the government introduces the right recovery program for the cocoa sector, internationally, can Ivory Coast regain its luster, for lack of a better word, given what's happened with soft commodities and cocoa in particular?
It can. I mean, absolutely it can. And I think, as David has commented, they're perhaps better placed than other countries in that part of the continent which went through wars. The problem is issues like when you're so dependent on a soft commodity, you have no control over that price. Much like the oil countries, the issue that they were talking about a moment ago with OPEC, where when the price is up, you're booming. When it's crashing, you're really in trouble. And it's where South Africa was back in the 80s. We were so dependent on gold, and bemoaning the moving away from it. Yeah, it's not nice if you're a gold miner and in that sector, but as an economy, you want that lack of dependence. You want to have better control. You'd rather make a motor car, but you can put the pieces together, add a markup, sell it internationally.
David, you were saying that the one characteristic, unique characteristic of the Ivorian conflict is that you didn't have a mass destruction of the local infrastructure. So that means that they have a backbone on which to rebuild this country. The port of Abidjan is known to have been one of the better utilized ports in West Africa and is still seen as a significant portal for trade in that region. How's that?
Absolutely.
How are the prospects for that?
I think the Port of Abidjan and Ivorian authorities are now paying attention to how to revamp that plan, but also develop San Pedro and other elements in the country, which is very important. IMF and World Bank just allocate or just awarded every coast with something like 60 billion US dollars to support the construction of the building of 2 bridges within the country to facilitate the flows of merchandise from Africa to neighboring country or elsewhere, which will be very important for the country. But the successful completion of all those projects and the coming back of investors will depend on how the political process is actually carried out.
Okay, and the coming back of investors will also depend on how the donor community treats the Ivory Coast. You've mentioned the IMF and World Bank assistance program, and they've got a variety of initiatives underway, but basically saying that with the amount of money that the World Bank can put into the Ivory Coast and with the government also introducing some economic reforms to the banking sector, working on a tighter budget, we could see 6% growth in the Ivory Coast this year. Is that possible?
That's a bit exaggerated, I will say, because looking at some of the conditions, reality on the ground could not really point to that growth. It will be fine if Ivory Coast can reach 6% growth, but I will be very cautious and limit it to 3.2% or maybe an acceleration up to 4%. Given the global economic meltdown, I think everybody is actually suffering from the effect of that crisis, and also domestic impediments that may arise from the leadership, that may arise from a regional contradiction, that may arise from difficulties in the major economic sector of the country to recover very quickly, because the end of the election does not mean the end of a conflict and the end of a political contentions, and we need to take all those factors into consideration.
Spanner in the works. I mean, we know that reconstruction of war-torn African countries obviously depends on infrastructure investments. It depends on a government that works properly, as David has suggested, but it depends on some of these structural adjustment elements that come in from the IMF and World Bank, sort out monetary policy, rein in excessive government spending, cut down on a bloated bureaucracy, especially when you're talking government of national unity. It hasn't worked in a lot of African countries. What's an alternative way?
I think it's also, we talk about cutting down the bureaucracy as one example, and you can understand where the donors are coming from. They look at a bloated bureaucracy and say, but that's also in many cases in civil service, and that's a job of status, but it's a job, it's an income, you're supporting family and the like. I think there needs to be more pragmatic on the ground looking at it, and looking at perhaps a bloated bureaucracy and saying, okay, we understand it, but you can't just cut it in half. There's implications, social and political implications there, and look at them more in a process. The infrastructure spend and rebuilding always works well. It gets money and it gets money flowing, can help with growth, it can certainly work there. But rather than the old school of slimmed down government, might be a nice idea, but there's the other side of the coin.